So the last slide didn't, or the last video did kind of stopped recording very well. So I just kind of want to rehash a little points on the shift in supply slide. Okay. So just like demand shifters, we had supply shifters, and they will move the supply line either in or out. And by in or out, I'm not talking about, before I get there, what goes on the y-axis? Price. What goes on the x-axis? Quantity. Okay. So if I have a supply curve, which way should it slope? It should slope upwards because of the law of supply. As goods gain in price, more suppliers want to produce that good because the suppliers receive the price in exchange for supplying the good. So basically, the higher the price, generally the higher the profit. Plus, on top of that, the higher the price, because price acts as a signal, more suppliers can enter the market. So that sends a signal to the would-be entrepreneurs of the world. Hey, I should enter into this market. If the market's for good one and good one all of a sudden has an increase in price, then you'd see people who are entrepreneurs entering into good one, or existing businesses might add a good one line. And keep in mind that supply maps pretty closely, in particular willingness to supply maps pretty closely with the cost. So the higher the cost, the lower the willingness to supply. So if you have a price that increases, okay, you are basically saying you're allowing high cost suppliers into the market. So at first it starts where the lowest cost suppliers are entering the market. That would be down here on the supply curve towards the bottom. If it freezes again, it's at the bottom of the supply curve. Up here at the top of the supply curve are the highest cost providers, at least as depicted. Okay, so the higher the price, the more you can justify particular costs. So that's another way by which you'll have new entrants into the market. And then correspondingly, the lower the price, people who previously were willing to supply here, okay, who would be the higher cost producers, if the price lowers, they're not making a profit anymore. And by profit, I'm talking revenue minus explicit cost minus opportunity cost. But they're not making a profit anymore, so they will leave the market. Okay, so a good way to think about the supply curve is it's basically a ranking of producers' cost. Okay, so lowest cost producers are going to be towards the left, the bottom of the supply curve. Those are low cost. And the top of the supply curve will be the higher cost people. So as the price increases, people who were high cost can end up making a profit if the price goes high enough. Okay. All right. So what do I mean by a supply shifter? Is a supply shift, you're changing quantity supplied from here to here? No, just like a demand shift, that's not the case. And the reason being is supply is a relationship of price and quantity supplied. It's two variables. It's a function of quantity supplied and price. Okay, so if I give you a supply curve, it's usually going to be equal. It's going to be like price equals some slope times quantity supplied plus some intercept. Okay, so supply is a function of quantity supplied and price. Okay, and because of that, there's a relationship it has, those two variables have with each other. So if the quantity supplied is increasing from here to here, if it slows from the lower point to the upper point, that's not a shift of the supply curve. It's not that the function is changing. What's happening is you're moving along the supply curve. So it could be that the price has changed. So if the supply equation is P equals 2 times quantity. Oh, should be quantity supplied. Okay, if that's your supply curve, and you change the price from 2 to 4, the quantity supplied is going to move from 1 to 2. It's a relationship. But the underlying supply has not changed. The underlying supply is still given by the equation P equals 2QS. Okay. But when you have a supply shift, a supply shifter, that will move the graph, what you're saying is for all of the prices, your quantities are now either higher or lower, depending on the direction of the shift. Okay. So you're changing the underlying function. Okay. So we can have S2, and I'm going to write it below, equals, so P, price, is equal to 2Q S plus 3. Okay, so what does that mean? That means for every price, or for every quantity supplied, price is now going to be 3 higher. Okay, so if we're looking at this graph, I'm going to draw this one in orange, or let's do it in blue so it's a little bit clearer. Okay, but basically your intercept is now increased. Okay, so the intercept is the point on the y-axis where it crosses 0. So I'm going to draw a new intercept, and this will be my S2. Okay, so for the same quantity supplied as before, so if it was 1 and 2, right? If before this point here was quantity equals 1, price equals 2. Okay, and this was quantity equals 2, price equals 4, and that's along the original supply curve. Okay. Now, when quantity equals 1, what's the price? It's 2 times 1 plus 3, so that's 5. So 1, 5. Okay. So holding one of the variables consistent, the other variable has changed. The relationship between the two variables has changed. So the underlying function is different given a supply shift. And that's kind of really the point I want to drive home, is that the underlying function is going to be different when you have a supply shifter, when you have a demand shifter, when you have a change in preferences. Okay, they're all other ways of saying that the overall relationship between price and quantity is now different than it was before. Whereas a shift along the supply curve from one point to another on the same line is the same relationship. It's just realizing itself at a different point on the graph. Okay. So I talked about the supply shifters, and I don't want to talk too much. I do. Let's put them all up, and then I'll give a brief one-line summary. So technological progress and input prices essentially deal with the overarching cost that it takes to produce something. So if input prices go down, it's now less costly to produce a good. So your input prices will be like the wage you pay your workers, the price of your capital, the amount of training that workers have to go through, that kind of thing. Those are your input prices. The cost of your land, the cost of your rent, the cost of your electricity. Those are all input prices. Okay, if they go down, you can supply more for the same cost. So you'd expect cost to go down. And what did I say about when cost goes down? When cost goes down, people are more willing to supply because higher cost producers are now lower cost producers. Okay, so basically that would be like a shift from S2 to S1. Cost has gone down. The same number of the businesses can, like, if this business at quantity 1 had to have 5 as a price to justify its cost, now it can justify its cost at price equals 2. Okay. So basically, the lower the input price, so input is what the supplier pays for its production. The lower the input price, the lower the cost. The lower the cost, the more potential suppliers and the more that they can supply. Okay. Same thing with technological progress. Essentially, technological progress is a way for input costs to decrease in the long run. Okay. One thing I do want to note, technological progress is not always linear. So it could be the case that in the short term, things progress, but they do so in a destructive way. This is what this guy, Joseph Schumpeter, said. It's called it's the theory of creative destruction. So basically, like, when you hear the term disruption in the tech world, what they mean by that is they're disrupting an existing industry. They're coming up with a new model that is technological progress, and it's probably cheaper and more efficient in the long run. But in the short run, it's kind of tossing the existing businesses on their head. They don't know what to do. So those existing businesses might have to shift in their production. But in the long run, it'll shift out production. Okay. But for the purposes of the test, if I say that there's technological progress, I'm talking about technological growth that is on net beneficial. So it'll increase supply, which will be an outward shift of the graph. Okay, so an outward shift from S2 to S. Okay, that is a technological progress. Moving further rightwards is an outward shift. Okay, and that's good because that means for every price you have more quantity. Okay. Price of related outputs. I don't want to spend any more time on this. I don't particularly care for this one because I think it can confuse it, but it is important in the real world, so I did want to cover it the first time around, but I don't need to cover it a second time. Change in expectation, kind of similar. I don't like those two because they're both like second order effects, so they tend to happen after the original effects, and they kind of confuse the problem, I think. So it is important, particularly if you're like buying a stock, you want to know where it's going to be in a year. But don't worry about it for the purpose of this class. And if you have questions about it, feel free to ask them. But I don't want you to stress too much on that. And then lastly, size of the industry. So the more producers, the higher quantity supplied. Easy peasy. All right. So let's move on to the definition of equilibrium. So I'll do that in another video.